Okay, this is a voice recording for tissues. I'm going to focus on the different types of tissues, some of the products or properties of the tissues, where they're located, and some key features for identification. We'll also go over glands a little bit. We'll focus more of this in the next unit, and then some of the membrane stuff. So first off, there are four major types of tissues: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nervous. Let's focus obviously on the first one here. But before we do that, what is a tissue? So what is a tissue? Let's see if we can get this to pen up for us. A tissue is a collection of cells that has a similar purpose. Right, so there are similar types of cells, and they're going to end up doing similar types of things. So if you're looking at epithelial cell, we'll talk about what epithelial's purpose is. They're made up of multiple types of cells, but once again, similar type of purpose. So you take a bunch of tissues, roll them together, multiple different types of tissues, and you can end up having organs, right? Multiple organs together, you get an organ system, and then on to the organism. So there is what is a tissue. So it's a collection of cells that have similar purpose. Epithelial, key characteristics. Epi, prefix, means surface. So we're talking about cells that are on the surface. Remember that you are a fancy donut, so we're talking not only about the outside of you, but also the inside part of you. Oh, that's an awesome you. So we talk about, here's your body. Wow, you are sexy. The outside of you, so we're talking about the surface here, right? Hands, arms, things like that, but also the surface that literally goes all the way down through you and out the other side. So epithelial cells will be found on the surface of your entire body. So the outside and the outside of you as well. So these are surface cells. There's major categories and shapes that go with them. Big thing is that they're going to be all about absorbing, right, or secreting. And we do get a little bit of protection as well, and we'll talk about that when we get there. So category shapes, categories, we have simple or stratified, meaning that we have multiple layers. And then shapes we have is squamous, which is a flat cell. Pardon my spelling if I spell it wrong. Cuboidal, which is much more squarish. And then we have columnar, which looks like a column. Now, with the stratifieds, we also have ones that the cells attach at the basement membrane, but then look like they don't reach up to the surface, or we'll have ones that are longer, right? And an example of something like that, where you have nuclei in different spots, that would be a pseudo-stratified. We'll look at some of those as we go through the PowerPoint here. All right, so first one here. This is simple squamous. You can see that there's a single layer here of very flat cells. We have an open area, which we will call the lumen. We'll talk about that more and more. So we're talking about some sort of absorbing or excretion across this simple layer here. The underside of this is the basement membrane, and then we have connective tissue on the other side of this. Looks like, as far as this tissue goes, I think that's about all I can say for simple squamous. The next one, we're looking at columns of cells here. We can see that lumen again, so we have this open pocket, and these cells are only one layer, so this is simple columnar. You can see they have much more of a defined shape than squamous, that is much flatter. All right, so we went back here, see much flatter, much more of a defined rectangular shape. And notice that the nuclei are all around the same plane. We don't see nuclei up high and then down low. They're all about in the same plane. So we're going to see these in digestive cavities. If we start seeing cilia, and you have to know what cilia are, if we see cilia on them, which are these little finger-like projections made out of cytoskeleton components, then we would see these maybe in the trachea, where We might see a goblet cell as well, where a goblet cell is a type of columnar cell or pseudostratified columnar cell that literally secretes mucus up into this lumen cavity, and then the cilia have the ability to move that mucus back and forth through the cavity, that lumen area. Right? So that's the lumen here, is that open spot. Next one we've got, you can kind of see they're much shorter. So these are cubes. The LU stands for lumen. So we have cuboidals going down here, and you're going to see these more in ducks. Right? So if we talk about sweat glands or oil glands, any of those are what are called sebaceous glands. Any of those types of ducts, you're going to see these cube-like cells. It looks kind of like there's multiple layers, but notice that there's another lumen right here. So that's one layer here and one layer here. So this is a simple cuboidal. When we go to stratified cuboidals, they're much rarer. You're going to see these in glands that are much bigger. So simple cuboidal is much more common in the body than stratified cuboidal. So cube-shaped, right, as opposed to columnar-shaped, definitely more defined than a squamous. So you can rule out the squamous, the very flat cells that don't have as much of a defined shape. Here I'm showing you a multiple layer squamous. So you can see very flat cells up top, right, layers and layers and layers. When we get down here, we've got some connective tissue below it. And the reason I wrote keratin, keratin is a protein that tends to be secreted into these into the stratified squamous cells. And keratin is a strong protein. This is something you would see in an area that is calloused, right? So maybe the palm of your hand, right, or the sole of your foot. You're going to see these types of cells. It's all about protection here. So literally you slough off these cells, layers and layers of these cells. So in this scenario here, we've got epithelial tissue that acts more for protection, right? Wear and tear. It's not writing. Protection. And this keratin will also help with water resistance, because we don't want to be leaking water out of our body, and we don't really want to drink through our fingers either. So water protection is another key feature of that keratin. So we're seeing this in stratified squamous, right, very flat cells, be able to identify that through the microscope and be able to answer questions on the test. All right, next up we have nuclei that are up, down, right? They're not in an even plane. They look very much more columnar. They're all they're not as evenly defined as our straight up regular columnar or simple columnar. So this is pseudo-stratified because it looks like there's two layers, but there's not. Pseudo meaning fake. Stratified, many layers. Ciliated. You can see the little fingers there, right? And then columnar. You can see the goblet cells nicely here. Here's a goblet cell. Here's a goblet cell, right? And they secrete that mucus up onto the surface here, and then that cilia, like I said, moves that mucus up and down. You'll see this in the trachea, right, your windpipe. You see this kind of stuff in the digestive system as well to move things around, right? Basal lamina, this is the basement membrane where the pseudostratified cells attach to dense irregular tissue or smooth muscle tissue, possibly, of connective. Right, so this is connective. So it's an interface between epithelial and connective tissue. Transitional, the last of the epithelials. You're seeing multiple different shapes here. So we got some cubes up high, we've got some squamous stuff, all kinds of weird things going on. And then you look at the basement membrane and look at how wrinkled up the basement membrane is. That's because this transitional epithelial has stretching qualities, right? So we see this in the urinary bladder, because we want the urinary bladder to be able to fill up and expand and hold liquid for us so that we're not going to the bathroom all the time. So this is transitional, a lot of funky different shapes and cells. We don't see a real good pattern. And then check out the basement membrane. That always helps. We get a very rolled or elastic fiber type of basement membrane where it's all kind of bent up. So we could straighten that out and it would look like layers of squamous cells if we pulled that transitional material. Moving on. Connective tissue. Common feature of connective tissue is protective, right? Oh, protective. We see some transport here, and it bridges between materials in your body. Common fibers, we have collagenous. Collagenous fibers are going to be fibers that are really strong. You have elastic fibers, which, kind of like it sounds, is going to be very stretchy. And then you have reticular fibers. I kept out reticular fibers as far as the slides because we didn't really have any reticular tissue. But it is very similar to the other fibers made by fibrocytes that will secrete protein materials to produce collagen, elastin, and reticular fibers. But these are all found throughout all types of different connective tissues. So if I showed you collagenous fibers, depending on how it looks, it might be something that is very strong, right? But it's probably pretty packed, so it's going to be something like a tendon or a ligament. Whereas elastic things, you might see some more space in it because it's going to have some flex to it and some ability to not only stretch but then respond back to its original state. All right, so first picture of connective tissue. You see a lot of open space here. It's where it's very loose. We see some collagen fibers here. We see some elastin fibers here. We see some fibrocytes here, cells that are making those. So this is areolar. And the areolar tissue is going to be a connective tissue maybe between epithelial and underlying tissues, right? So maybe something like the dermis or to muscle, right? We also might see this connecting between organs. Right, so it's a real thin membrane. We'll see it a lot when we dissect later this year, that areolar tissue. It's a real fine, thin, see through it obviously here, this picture, but has strength, yet a little bit of stretch to it as well. All right, so the next one here, you see it's pretty dense, but notice there's not a defined pattern, so it's very irregular. So this is dense, irregular. That you would see in something like the dermis. Right, so this is just below the surface of the skin. So if you have epithelial up here, you would have right below the epithelial, we actually have a blood supply going to, because remember, epithelial, the top surface, really doesn't have a blood supply. It would have a nervous supply, but not a blood supply. And then the dermis, what we're looking at here, definitely has blood supply to it. So this is where we feed in, and then that epithelial tissue gets its nutrients via diffusion and osmosis between the dermis and its layer. So epithelial is that surface, dermis below it, that's that connective tissue. This is dense, irregular connective tissue. You can actually see those squamous cells up top here, and then the dermis tissue below it. So basement membrane right between those two facing them. All right, next one you can see lots of fibers here, right? Very organized, so wave up, wave down, very collagenous. So this is dense, regular tissue, what you're going to see out of tendons and ligaments. Okay, so being able to take on a heck of a lot of stress yet not rip is a big part of tendons and ligaments and dense, regular tissue. Next one here we see that it's pretty dense, but we got these little pockets, right? These little pockets actually have cells in them. So those are chondrocytes. This is a cartilage. And since it's so packed and it has fibers in it, we call this fibrocartilage. Okay, so this fibrocartilage you're going to find between bones of the spine, so that disc area. So if this is your spine here and this is your spine, the bone components between that, the cartilage that's between the bones, is this fibrocartilage. Is for protection, shock absorption. Okay. You can spell and write and talk at the same time. Kind of Next one. You see that there's these pockets again. We've got this ground substance through here, but notice that there's like little spidery-like lines all through the tissue. Those spidery-like lines are elastin. Oh. Okay, or elastic fibers. So this is elastic cartilage. So this is going to be cartilage that responds and bounces back. So like your outer ear, parts of your nose, things like in your larynx that has stretching, right, for vocal cords. So we have strength in the cartilage component, yet flexibility because of those fibers. Notice there's really no blood vessels in here, so cartilage has a hard time healing because there's a small amount of blood supply. Here we have a glassy appearance, right? Not fibery. You don't see those fibers in here, and then you still got those pockets. And those pockets are where the cells are. So we got that ground substance, which is the cartilage component, and then the chondrocytes that are making the cartilage. Obviously, you can see here this is hyaline cartilage, most common cartilage in the body. You see this that makes up the rings of the trachea. Right, we'll see this at the ends of joints in a bone. Right, so the purpose is to protect not only the airway but also the joints so that the bones aren't grinding together. Next one, we see cells. All kind of look like they have holes in the center, but actually it's just thinner there. And then we got these big, huge ones that have a purple stain to them. These are blood cells. You're looking at erythrocytes, or red blood cells here, and then leukocytes, or white blood cells here. Please make sure that you note the difference between the two. This has a stained nucleus. Red blood cells do not because they don't have nuclei. Next one, we're seeing kind of a tree ring pattern here, right? Kind of see that they're laying themselves out. We're going to look at this a heck of a lot in another unit or two, but this is bone, one of the hardest of the connective tissues here. We have blood supply through the bone so that they can grow and heal, but it's limited. And then we move on to muscle tissue. The purpose of muscle tissue is movement. All right, we got fibers that make it up. You'll see those muscle fibers here in a second. There's some characteristic differences between them. And then division between the muscle tissues is whether or not it's involuntary, meaning that we can actually control it, or voluntary, which means we can control it. Right. So the first one here, we see there's definitely some, I don't know if you can see it on your screen or not, but there's little zebra bands on here, right? And then you notice that the fibers kind of come and then they branch in areas. If we see that branching with the fibers, that means that this is cardiac. So you find this in the heart. Okay. And those zebra lines will help you identify it as well. So this is movement of the heart. This is the muscle tissue that makes up a majority of the heart. You do have some integration of nervous system and some adipose tissue and things like that as well. Next one, we see that it's kind of zoomed out here. I wish I would have grabbed a better picture, but the tissue, each one of the fibers kind of has this spindly, spread out, narrow down, and it kind of swirls around type of deal. So this is smooth, which is an involuntary muscle, just like, I'm sorry, the last one, this is involuntary as well. And we don't have control over it. This is going to be, makes up different types of organs, so things like your stomach, your small intestine, that you don't have to think about, your esophagus. Movements of these muscles that make up these organs is involuntary, and it's a smooth muscle that's allowing for that to happen. Last picture of the muscles is skeletal muscle. You can see it's very arranged, no branching really. You can see some nuclei in here. And then you can definitely see these zebra bands. So this is skeletal. You have control of this, so this is voluntary. And this is going to make up the muscles that attach to bones, right? Kind of why it's called skeletal muscle. You can control that once again, and things like your bicep, tricep are examples of ones that are skeletal. Nervous tissue characteristics. We have usually a cell body of some sort, right? And then we have input and output. So we have these dendrites that feed in, the axon that feeds out. And we'll talk more about how a nerve works, a neuron, and what causes them to fire and whatnot. There's a cell body that has a nucleus. Purpose is communication and sensing. Right, so we can communicate throughout our body with them. We can sense both the external environment and the internal environment with neurons. Picture of it, you can see all the little cell bodies here, right? And here you can see a nice big cell body, little dendrites and axons feeding in and out of it. Right, here's another picture, so you can see those dendritic extensions in, right? We end up having an axon coming out. Right, so that's your body and whatnot. That's okay. Glands, two major types. You have endocrine and you have exocrine. Right, so endocrine and exocrine. Okay, continuing on here. Endocrine versus exocrine. We'll talk more about endocrine. We'll get to the whole unit on endocrine. So this is about secreting things directly into the supply. And then exocrine is talking about putting the contents into ducts and secreting it into something like a lumen or to the surface of the skin. So we're talking about sweat glands. We're talking about oil, sebaceous glands, things like that. Also, the pancreas is one of these dual glands. It actually has endocrine and exocrine properties. So the pancreas is like this, where it actually secretes. Wow, that's good spelling there. Pancreas. Okay, you don't care. Into the blood, like insulin into the blood, or glucagon into the blood. And in ducts, it'll secrete digestive enzymes into the small intestine. So endocrine is where we're. So there's a couple types of exocrine glands: merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. Merocrine is directly making a substance like an enzyme that is secreted by the cells into the duct. Apocrine, we really don't define as much, even though there are some glands that are still defined as apocrine glands. They're actually more merocrine or a holocrine, where a holocrine, a cell is made, the cell ruptures. Wow, rup, R-U-P, cheers. And the contents are spilled. And that's more something like the sebaceous or an oil gland or mammary gland, more like this. Whereas merocrine is more enzyme derived, like a sweat gland or something like that. Apocrine would be a cell fracturing type of thing, and pieces of the cell go into the duct. We realize now that it's more of a rupture type of thing, where the contents from that cell that was being made are the important thing, and the cell pretty much dies in a holocrine situation. All right. I believe. Oh, membrane. Sorry. Mucous membrane is a membrane that secretes obviously mucus to the exterior. So eyes, things like that. Sections of the lungs would be. I am talking in exterior. I apologize. Clearly, my blood sugar. The exterior, so things like eyes or digestive areas. You know, we're talking about goblet cells for the mucous membranes and things like that. Synovial are round joints. If you have two bones coming together, we'll talk more about this. So you have these two bones coming together that make a capsule around these bones. It secretes synovial fluid in here, lubricates the joints so the joints aren't grinding. And then serous membranes are ones that surround cavities and organs in those cavities. And serous membranes, you have parietal and visceral types of serous. And visceral. parietal is going to literally line the cavity, whereas visceral lines the organ inside that cavity. So we talked about thoracic cavity, so any membrane that surrounds the entire thoracic cavity would be parietal. Visceral would be the ones that surround the lungs or the heart or something like that. So keep those in mind. The one thing I did as I went into pause mode is make sure you know what adipose tissue looks like. So here's a picture of adipose tissue. Right, so we have this spidery type of look, but notice that the purple is actually the cell membrane. You can actually see some nuclei here. And this big open area is the fat. Around the outside is the cell membrane, and inside is the fat. So that is the tissues review. Hopefully that wasn't too much of a mess. I apologize if it was. Any little bit helps though, right? So if you have questions, email me or watch the video again or look at your and